I want to first welcome everyone. Welcome to the speakers. Hi, Sally and Valeska and Pinkan who have joined us today. And also a warm welcome to all of our attendees with us today. Good morning and also good afternoon to everyone joining from Australia. Today, we are here in the webinar about how will IA-CEPA or the Indonesian-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement contribute to Indonesia's food security and economy. This webinar is held by the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, a nonprofit policy think tank based in Jakarta, Indonesia. My name is Felipa Amanta, and I will be your host and moderator this morning/afternoon. So here we're talking about the IA-CEPA, that after 10 years of negotiation between Indonesia and Australia, the Indonesia's parliament has finally ratified the IA-CEPA or the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement in February this year. And the agreement will come into force on July 5th, 2020. So it's coming up very, very soon. Through this ratification, the IA-CEPA is targeted to be able to strengthen Indonesia's presence in the global value chain, which comes at the right time as we're looking forward to economic recovery after COVID-19. In addition, Australia is also expected to invest in strategic sectors in Indonesia, and it also is expected to form partnerships with us. As the name suggests, the IA-CEPA is a comprehensive agreement that stretches across so many different sectors and touches so many industries, including one of them is on food security, and I mean food and agriculture. So what does this agreement mean for Indonesia and for Australia? What are the implications for our economies? We will be digging deeper about this in this webinar today with our distinguished speakers, which have so graciously joined us today to share their insights, each with their own unique perspective. We have Pinkan Audreen, a researcher at Center for Indonesian Policy Studies. We also have Valeska from Meat and Livestock Australia, who works closely with the private sector between Australia and Indonesia. And we also have Sally Dean, the Senior Trade Commissioner of Austrade, who worked so hard on trade between Indonesia and Australia. And with great speakers, we are also joined with great audience as well. I wanted to give a shout out to see who's in the room. So we have here attendees from various sectors, including ministries, think tanks, private sectors, universities and academia, the media, and many more. In particular, we wanted to give a shout out. We see someone from the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We also have someone from the President's Special Staff Team, from the Parliament, and also people from embassies, various embassies as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. We also have, if there are people from the media, thank you and welcome. Just an FYI, we will be sending out a press release after the webinar. And furthermore, just want to remind everyone that this webinar will be recorded, and it's also currently available live streamed on YouTube as well. So you can share that with your colleagues if they haven't had a chance to register. The recording will be also available to be shared later by our team. So feel free, if you want to re-watch the video, you can do that afterwards. The link to the live stream on YouTube will be shared very soon in the chat box. So keep your eyes on that. So just to give you a glimpse of today's agenda for the webinar, we will be holding this webinar for about 1 hour. The webinar will have 2 sessions. The first session is a presentation from our speakers that I have mentioned, about 5 to 7 minutes each. And then afterwards, we will be having a Q&A session. The speakers are, as I mentioned, we have Pinkan Audreen, the researcher at CIPS. We also have Valeska from Meat and Livestock Australia. And we also have Sally Dean, the Senior Trade Commissioner. And then During all of the presentation, we welcome any question and answer that you want to post. You can directly drop those in the question and answer box down below. Use the format name, institution, and to whom the question is addressed. And if your question is represented already, you can also simply vote for the existing questions, and you can make sure that the question is seen. So we welcome question at any time of the discussion. Feel free to just drop it in the Q&A box down below. Before we start the discussion though, I wanted to give the room for discussion to the audience actually. So we wanted to see what people think about IA-CEPA, because as we know, it's a huge agreement and it covers so many different aspects. So let's start with a quick polling or a word cloud that we want to do. We want to hear from you what you think. So if you don't mind, you can go to slido.com and put in the hashtag IA-CEPA. So quickly move to any browser, or you can pull up your phone and go to slido.com and then enter the hashtag IA-CEPA. We wanted to hear what you think. What comes to your mind when you hear the word economic partnership? I know this is a lot of different aspects go into economic partnership. Just out of curiosity, what do you think? So we would invite your participation by joining in through entering slido.com and then putting the hashtag IA-CEPA. I will give some moments to make sure. Oh, okay, great. We are starting to have some answers joining in. We have opportunity. That's very optimistic. We also have trade. We have very specific partnerships as well. We have dairy products. Let's see, we have mutual benefits. Trade is the bigger one, which means that more people are entering the word trade in here. And let's see, we have more words. We have people think about competition when they think about economic partnership. They also think about better tariffs, which is one of the key things that comes out of the IA-CEPA. We also have a lot of positive words like caring, benefit, growth, wealth. The biggest one still being trade here. So a lot of people, when they hear economic partnership, they automatically think trade. I wanted to give a few more minutes to people. I'll give perhaps 30 more seconds for people to jot down what they think. And you also can see in the screen, the words are popping up. We have, other than trade, we have two other words that are coming up. We have cooperation and we also have growth. So those three things are things that people think about when they think about economic partnership. A lot of trade, a lot of mutual interests, mutual prosperity. So I see a lot of mutual being thrown out. So really emphasizing that this is a mutual thing between Indonesia and Australia. We also have competition. Great, I'll give 5 more seconds and then I'll just recap this really quickly. All right, great. So we can stop the polling and then just quickly go over that. So the polling was really interesting. Thank you all who participated. We have a lot of really interesting insights. People really emphasizes the word trade and growth and cooperation, mutual cooperation as well. A lot of mutual being thrown around. So thank you very much. That was an interesting insights. And then to hear more about these kinds of dimensions about the trade and the cooperation, we will jump to our speakers who will be sharing their insights. First, this discussion will be started by our very own Pinkan Aldrin, researcher at CIPS, who's been conducting research on IA-CEPA and doing analysis on IA-CEPA. So maybe Pinkan, you can get us started. We hear from the participants and the attendees that a lot of the things that come out of economic partnership is trade. So do you mind sharing your analysis of what this means to trade and growth? So the Zoom is yours, Pinkan.
Okay, thank you, Pipa, for the time. Yeah, it's really interesting to see from the participants' point of view about economic partnerships. And yeah, I noticed there are several terms that really correlates with IA-CEPA. There's like trade, of course, and also money. It could be like an investment kind of things. And it's really, we would like to discuss about that today. So I will share the presentation. Yeah, is it on screen now? Oh, yeah, okay, sure. So at the moment in CHIPS, we are working on a paper. Basically, I'm working with Mas Andre Suryanta and also Pak Arianto Patunru. And today we'll share about the key findings or this paper. So it's basically talking about the Indonesian-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement and how it way forward to it, considering that today we're living in dynamic circumstances where the globalization also see a kind of a disruptions because of the coronavirus pandemic. So before we're talking about the IAC by itself, we can see from this way. Yeah, the Indonesia-Australia bilateral relations. So actually, last year we are commemorating the 17th anniversary for the diplomatic relations between Indonesia and Australia. And since then, there are so many um, commitment have been developed between these two countries, especially in social and economic sectors. And also we see that Indonesia have the embassy in Canberra, which supported by the consulate offices in major Australian cities like the Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, and also to Darwin. And here in Indonesia, we also have the diplomatic embassy in Jakarta and supported by also the emerging cities in such as Bali, Surabaya, and also the Makassar. And in a regional perspective, we see that this kind of cooperation also established under the ASEAN, Australia, and New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, which entered into force in 2010 for 8 countries, including Australia, and later in 2012, Indonesia also entered into force for this agreement. And we also see that we are part of the G20 countries. However, this kind of relationships still have a room for improvement for the bilateral trade relations between Indonesia and Australia. As we can see from these two tables here, um, the first one is about the Indonesia's merchandise export destinations. And we can see that here the Australia is placed in number 13. And for the import origins in 2018, it's still number 8. And it's really like there's a contested argument about this because we are living in a good proximity, the close relations between the Indonesia and Australia geographically. So it could be develop more economic partnerships, and there's so many room for that. And when we are talking about the exports and imports, we can see here's the figures about Indonesia's worldwide exports and imports in 2017, as we can see from the figure number 1 here. The palm oil, coal, natural rubber still dominates. And um, here we can see that the total value for Indonesia's exports bilaterally with Australia reached only 2.8 billion compared to the total of 207 billion US dollar in worldwide. So it's still a small amount of number. And oh, for the products, the most product being exported from Indonesia are crude petroleum, refined petroleum, and also shaped wood. And see in the figure number 2 here is the imported products. the total products here is also similar with the export one. We still see the petroleums, oil refines, and also the interesting part that different here is there's an ICT number is bigger, and also the computers, more on the technology, and also parts of motor vehicles. And in the yellow one is capturing the agricultural sectors, and also we are imported wheat and barley from Australia. And here we can see that the total value for Indonesian imports from Australia is higher than the export value. And then it's also have a bigger shares compared to the total in the worldwide imports. And for the most imported products, we have the coal, petroleum, coal briquettes, and also wheat. And it's really interesting of figures. But talking about the other than trade, we have the investment. And last year, the Indonesian um, Investment Coordinating Board, or BKPM, recorded that Australia is still the 10th largest FDI sender, with the value over 500 million Australian dollar investment. However, this is still quite small number compared to other countries like US, which invest 3 times more than that, and also China and Hong Kong, which it combined investment 20 times than the Australia. So in the other perspective, we can see also that Indonesia's holdings in Australia also still in a small number, and we can see there's still room for growth for that. And yeah, this close ties in diplomatic relations actually have not reflected equally in the depth of the economic relations between these two countries. It shows from the low volume of trade and also investment that we see from the previous slides. And the total two-way Australia's trade in goods and services with Indonesia, as can you see in here, is only reflects about 2% of Australia's export. So it's still making Indonesia the 13th largest trading partner for Australia, and we can see that still room for improvement on that. And then it's established the IA-CEPA. And what's interesting about the IA-CEPA is that it's have a long kind of discussion, and it was finally resulted in the signing process last year. So after around 10 years, and then we came into the decision between the two countries and developed agreement comprised of 21st chapter here. As you can see, there's a lot of interesting thing here. It's like we have the economic cooperation in chapter 15, and also regulations, things and agreements about the electronic commerce as well, considering the rapid growth in the economic commerce sectors in chapter 13. And then um, talking about the trade and investment provisions, here we see there's three big issues here is trade in goods, trade in services, and also the investment parts. Basically, for the investment, we see that there's a typical provisions that also resemble with the GATS. So we still have the national treatment, most favored nations, prohibition of performance requirements, and also there's a senior executive appointments for senior management and board of directors. And in the section B, we have an investor state dispute settlement mechanism that will help the investors from both countries. And talking about this also, we might be curious about what can in IA-CEPA contribute to our current or existing performance between these two countries. So for the trade key outcomes, uh, referring back to the chapter 15 as well, the implementation of the IA-CEPA Economic Cooperation Program is one of the things that is in the agreement. So that includes the preparation and the discussion about the draft of IA-CEPA ECP design report. And this agreement reached the focus areas in the IA-CEPA implementation, agri-food innovation partnerships, powering advanced manufacturing between two countries, and also co-investing in skills and training that will help more the human development in the two countries. And here in the table, we can see several examples of the change in tariffs and how it affects uh, for Australia and also Indonesia. And here we can have a live milk cattle, frozen beef, sheep meat, feed, grains, sugar, dairy, and vegetables. And there's also a lot of more things in the agreement, and we just highlighting this one. And then, okay, so talking about the food security here, we see that there's an opportunity for Indonesia to tap in the global value chain. The global value chain itself is integrating uh, the, uh, the process of developing products from raw materials into the processed products. But it's not only happen in one country alone. It could be in terms of cooperation. As we can see from these figures, I took this from the Alvarez rights, Alvarez Insights issues, and it's usual, previously stated the country A and B, but here we can change it like in Australia, Indonesia to give more clarity on terms of the visualization. So for the here we can see that in Australia there's agricultural productions, and it could be processing domestically in Australia to serve the consumers in Australia, but it can also um, process in other countries like Indonesia through the IA-CEPA agreement, and then the processing products could be consumed by Indonesian customers or consumers, and or also going to be the exported products. So there will be a value added in here, and it could also happen vice versa. And for this, this is also remain important for Indonesia because as we can see here that due to the coronavirus pandemic, some countries has closed their trade relations with other countries. So this kind of cooperation could really improve Indonesia's role in global value chain. As we also see from here that the global value chain or GVCs can further boost inclusive and sustainable growth, creating better jobs and reduce poverty. However, it should be noted that if we, Indonesia, would like to do that, there's need to be kind of a deeper reforms, and industrial countries or the processing countries should pursue open and predictable policies. So it's really important to be highlighted here. And talking about the key outcomes on investment part, we see there's a 3 points here. So based on the Indonesian Ministry of Trade, there are several areas for investment that would become the interest of the Australia, as we see, such as the vocational education and training or VAT, higher education, tourism, construction, mining, energy, hospital, and so on and so forth. And we can see here it's really resembles with what we exported and imported. So it could enhance our trade relations with Australia. And then some of the investment provisions are not very different from the posts that we already have. So it might be easier for the um, Indonesian investor to invest in Australia rather than Australian investor invest in here in Indonesia. So in terms of the time and also the policies should be improved, and also the two sectors has more relaxed terms for universities and hospitals. And yeah, it's there's also an MOU here in the pilot workplace-based training visa agreement that allows 200 of Indonesians to take up internship in Australia every year. And it's also complementing the new Colombo plan. And for the later one, we have also MOU and Indonesia-Australia skills development exchange pilot project here that allows up to 500 skilled workers to gain hands-on experience in both countries. So from here, we can pursue this as one of the economic recovery plan for both countries amidst the coronavirus pandemics, although it would not be easily proceed right now, but we still see there's a room from IA-CEPA that enables this to happen soon. And for the recommendations, you see that there's 6 points here. The first one, maximizing the GVC potential. We can see in meat and wheat. So it's basically from the Australia-Indonesia's relations, these two commodities in food are really important and play key roles in the trade between the countries. We already have the red meat and cattle partnership that happened since 2013, if I'm not mistaken, and it could the IA-CEPA would enables the grain partnership between the two countries. So it's really interesting if we can proceed further with that and reviewing the existing regulations that we have in Indonesia to maximize the potential that we have. And perhaps after this, Valeska can also share more about the red meat and cattle partnerships. And for the recommendation number 2, we would like to see the enhancing of the automatic import licensing implementation that would also be beneficial for the trade between the two countries. And then more on the investment part, a further trim on non-conforming measures align with the overall FDI reform unfolding in Indonesia. And then also focus investment here in education and healthcare providers, as we can see in previous slides, and also proactively utilize the internship workers exchange quota, and the last but not least, the expand existing development partnership program that already have happened between Indonesia and Australia. So I think that's all for my presentation today, and yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Pinkan, for that wonderful overview of what the IA-CEPA entails. And it touches upon so many sectors, as you mentioned, investments in education, in human capital, in health sector, and also trade, a lot of trade provisions. So moving on, I want to zoom in a little more closer to one of the aspects that you touched upon, which is the trade partnership on food, especially the red meat and cattle partnership, which has already established and is likely to continue. So, Valeska, we have here, which is the country director of Meat and Livestock Australia. If you can share a little bit from your experience with the partnership that already existed, or maybe perhaps the outlook of what the partnership will look like after the IA-CEPA. So the Zoom is yours, Valeska.
Thank you, Pipa, and good morning, everyone. Thank you, CIPS, for convening this discussion. I think the Australian red meat industry recognizes how vitally important Indonesia is, and we have a long-standing trade relationship in the beef and cattle aspects. Out of that, through the red meat and through the Meat and Livestock Australia, we are a service provider for the Australian red meat producers. The industry has had a presence in Indonesia for the past 20 years. And in fact, about 10 years ago, we have established a representative office in Indonesia, one of the only 8 offices that MLA has around the world. So the office actually coincided almost at the same time the IA-CEPA negotiations started. So we have been following it very closely, and now that it's come into completion almost a decade later, we are very excited to see this monumental agreement come into force next month. So yeah, thank you once again. Next slide. In terms of what the IA-CEPA benefits are, from our point of view, obviously the major and immediate outcome would be around the tariff reductions that Pinkan, you mentioned earlier, the improved import licensing arrangements. These provide for a more market-oriented import regime, and I think a lot of it has got to do and will then flow on to more trade stability and continuity. And what this means, it should allow for a more consistent supply and access to raw materials, as well as healthy and nutritional source of animal protein in the food security context. Well, I think, as you mentioned also, Pinkan, it's more than that. To us, the IA-CEPA itself, we can actually do more now to enhance the economic cooperation and collaboration end to end. So I see that the agreement provides a strong platform and a framework to deepen and broaden what we have been doing around the human capital investment element, for example. I think that there will be increased skills, knowledge, and expertise sharing opportunities, as you mentioned, to the skills exchange programs under IA-CEPA, for example. But also, I think more broadly in other areas, including in the digital space, I think we can share more expertise around the uptake of agriculture technology, sustainable resource management, digital economy, innovation, that sort of thing. And I see that as how do we then invest in the workforce of the future so that Indonesia and Australia can be part of that global value chain. We also see that there will be more investment into the best practices, standards and systems. And I think these are areas that probably have not been really looked into to date as deeply as we can do. But I think with IA-CEPA and that certainty in terms of regulations and trade, it now enables people, businesses to invest into how does Indonesia companies uplift their best practices, their standards to meet international requirements, and therefore tap into that global market. You talked about that global value chain again just now, and I will come back to that shortly. So overall, I think it's really about a more stronger, stable economic partnerships. And next slide. Thank you. And sometimes I think in terms of what we look at the value offering and the value add offering itself, I thought we can take a step back and just look at this whole Indonesia-Australia cattle and beef value chain. I've got the slide in front there just to kind of summarize a little bit about the value of the industry. And sometimes I think we might have taken it for granted, or we might have seen it as a little bit, just as a bit of a transactional trade. But we do have a strong value proposition. And I think it is a sector that has a huge multiplier effect to the socio-economy through things like employment, food security, livelihood improvements, biosecurity benefits, revenue, etc. And I think with IA-CEPA, again, I foresee that we can lift up this whole value chain, create more value, and again, come back to that, becoming that globally competitive joint partners in a global environment. So next slide again. Pinkan, you mentioned earlier about the red meat and cattle partnership. So yes, under the red meat and cattle partnership, I think this broader economic cooperation and collaboration is already happening and is already being actioned through the Indonesia-Australia partnership on food security in the red meat and cattle sector. The partnership itself has those 5 objectives that you see on the screen. It is a unique bilateral agreement. I don't think that we have such an agreement anywhere else in the world, in the red meat space at least. And it is sort of a joint collaboration between the Australian government, and the co-chair here is the BKPM in Indonesia. But it does look at how do we support the food security objectives, and how do we access that global supply chain through trade and investment. So one of the areas that the partnership is looking at the moment is how to operationalize that whole notion of value add and becoming that global value chain approach, that this whole notion. So for example, one of the things that the partnership is looking at the moment is how do we explore using Australian bred, Indonesian grown feeder cattle to produce beef and beef products that can be exported into other markets globally. This can be in the form of beef or beef floss or meatball or bakso balls, etc. The partnership is in the process of exploring these pathways. And hopefully in the next few months, we can actually have a better understanding of what kind of investment is required to achieve these things. I know that we talked earlier about the whole wheat to noodle analogy, and I think that sort of global value chain is already happening to a certain extent in Indonesia. I'm sort of surprised, for example, in the leather space, like cow hides, how much of Indonesia, how much cow hides are being used into leather and then value added into products like shoes and food, etc., and then exported overseas to the US, for example. I think that's those kind of opportunities that we can further tap into under IA-CEPA. So certainly, I think what the Red Meat and Cattle Partnership is doing, there's a lot of other activities since it's been running since 2013. But I think certainly in the exports and innovation space, it fits nicely with the agri-food innovation partnerships that was mentioned by Pinkan earlier. So I think IA-CEPA itself will definitely accelerate the depth and breadth of these cooperation. And ultimately, I think Indonesia and Australia can be that regional economic powerhouse. So that's kind of the snapshot from me. Back to you, Pipa. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Valeska, for that really in-depth look about what this really could mean in terms of Red Meat and Cattle Partnership and how that would come to implement the global value chain. Moving on, we also have Sally Dean. So we've talked about the Indonesian part, how we can take advantage of this, and perhaps we want to also hear from the Australian side. Going to our neighbor Sally, who's joining us from Canberra. Perhaps you can share a little bit your perspective on how we can maximize this, both from Indonesia and also Australia. So the Zoom is yours, Sally. You're still on mute. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Philippa, and thank you for the opportunity to join you today. After nearly 10 years in the making, we are, of course, very excited that entry into force of IA-CEPA, the Indonesia-Australia Economic Partnership, is just around the corner on the 5th of July. And as you've heard from other speakers, it will deliver a range of practical benefits for both sides. For Australia, 99% of Australian exports will be able to enter into Indonesia tariff-free, and for Indonesia, on entry into force, all remaining tariffs will be eliminated. So, delivers some terrific outcomes, and it also delivers a range of safeguards around issues like data sovereignty, agricultural market access, which you've heard about, services and investment, and it also concludes provisions for enhanced economic cooperation. So overall, it's a great achievement, but the mere existence of the agreement doesn't mean that opportunities will automatically start to flow. Really, its success depends on what we collectively do next, and building a closer economic partnership, which is obviously the goal of IA-CEPA, is going to require commitment on both sides that goes beyond just implementing the agreement. It has to be about building business-to-business partnerships and encouraging investment on both sides. And collectively, we need to focus what we can do on both sides to make that happen. So given that I'm here representing Austrade, Australia's Trade and Investment Agency, I wanted to sort of focus my comments this afternoon on really what we can do to focus on getting the other elements of other elements that we have to get right to make sure that we get the most out of the agreement on both sides. So what are the sort of other elements that we need to focus on? And of course, there are many, but I wanted to focus on a couple of areas, and those being, I think we've got a lot to share in terms of education. We've heard from our other speakers on that. I think we can do some work around lifting the business investment, improving the business environment, and also employing some innovations around how we support our businesses to develop relationships and do what they do best, which is to do business. So if I can just start with education, Obviously, this is a real area of strength in the relationship and one that we should build on. It also aligns education as one of Australia's deepest areas of capability, but also aligns with President Jokowi's priority to improve skills across the population, Indonesian population. So you may have heard that some of the outcomes from IA-CEPA deliver great outcomes in the education space. We've seen Central Queensland University, CQU, has already established a joint venture with Bakri University, and Monash University has also announced that they plan to open a standalone campus in Indonesia. We're also keen to see more Australian vocational education and training providers launch operations in Indonesia, and again a key outcome out of IA-CEPA will allow for Australian vet providers to deliver their services in Indonesia. And whilst they represent financial investments into Indonesia, importantly, they also bring capability and capacity around education delivery. So we are, of course, very excited about that area of deepening our economic partnership. Turning now to the business in lifting business investment, this is going to be critical across a range of sectors, and it's obviously a key outcome that is being sought through IA-CEPA. So you've already heard that it's true that Australian investment in Indonesia is not as substantial as we would like, particularly given the proximity of our two nations and also the complementarity of our economies. However, we shouldn't lose sight of the successes. As you've heard, Australia is one of Indonesia's top 10 investors, and with a little over $10 billion invested based on official statistics. Those investments are in a wide range of sectors. They span manufacturing facilities through companies like Arnott's, Coca-Cola, Amatil, BlueScope and Orica. They are in agribusiness with CBH flour milling and Cheetham Salt, in financial services institutions through the CBA, and they also are in services with businesses like Ramsay Health Group, which operates 3 hospitals, and Telstra, which delivers services, cloud services and enterprise network management services in partnership with Telecom Telstra. And we also have Australian investment in mining services with companies like Thiess and Macmahon. Importantly, Australian investors into Indonesia are often also reinvestors, and that is often how Australian investment works. And I'd point to a recent example, which was Coca-Cola Amatil, which is one of Australia's largest employers in Indonesia, recently announced plans in May to develop a plastic bottle recycling plant. So we do see that Australian investors are also some of our biggest reinvestors. Improving the business environment is something we must also get right. And Indonesia and Australia are both doing a lot of work in this space, because what we do know is that businesses will invest when the risk and returns are right and they are alongside people they trust. So for those of us supporting the Australia-Indonesia business relationship, I think we need to look at how we can better help businesses form the networks that they need to make new partnerships and feel confident investing in our respective countries. And that's particularly important at the moment, given that travel is restricted, and those face-to-face relationships that are so important in things like building trust in a financial investment relationship are really important. So we need to think about how do we get around that, and how can we work together to push through some of the regulatory barriers that we have that our businesses face, and also how can we deepen and broaden and refresh the Australia-Indonesia business networks that will help drive forward those new investments. These are things that both sides are focused on, and a number of the initiatives that were announced during President Widodo's visit to Australia in February go towards addressing those challenges. You'll see on the screen there some commitments that the Australian government has made, but also were included as part of the announcements out of President Widodo's visit. And they go to addressing some of those areas that I've just mentioned. So, for example, the commitments include a regular meeting, the establishment of regular meetings of economic, trade and investment ministers on both sides, supported by a group of senior economic officials, and with a focus on really driving forward the agenda of mutual beneficial reform. It also includes a soon-to-be-established CEO roundtable with business leaders from both countries, which will form a forum for senior and a mechanism and a pathway through which senior business leaders can provide their voice into the bilateral economic agenda. And when conditions allow, we have a commitment from the Australian Minister for Trade, Investment and Tourism to bring a group of Australian business leaders to Indonesia from sectors with high potential for growth and new partnerships. And they include sectors like education, agribusiness and food, and services. At a practical level, organisations like my own, together with other Australian government agencies, are looking for opportunities to work closely with Indonesian counterparts, as well as industry associations and bilateral business chambers on practical projects to help business take new risks and make new investments. Indeed, my own Austrade team in Indonesia is already progressing plans to work with Indonesia's Employers Association, KADIN, to co-design some projects in key areas where we think there are real opportunities to help drive uptake of opportunities by business. So again, in areas like agribusiness, education and e-commerce. We also plan, Austrade also plans to work with other agencies to deliver a digital campaign to share opportunity level information across key sectors. And we are trying to make better use of digital platforms to get the right content out to the right audiences. For example, on the Australian side, the Department of Foreign Affairs has developed an FTA portal, and that provides an excellent resource for Australian business to access core FTA information. Tackling regulatory reform and making it easier for business to do what they do best will also be critical. Australia and Indonesia were already making progress in this space, but with COVID-19, we have seen some acceleration of these trends. For example, Indonesia has shifted to accept electronic certificates of origin in order to claim free trade agreement benefits. And this has broadened electronic certificates of origins from the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA to all FTAs. And the implementation of the new business registrations in Indonesia through the online single service portal run by BKPM has been a very important and very welcome reform. On the Australian side, we're doing a lot of work to develop a one-stop shop for exporters, a trade information service, and that is to provide access for all export and import regulatory information in one place. The final point I just want to address is around innovation in how we share information about business opportunities and how to use IA-CEPA, particularly at a time when international travel is restricted and more business is being processed digitally. Austrade, my own organisation, is doing a lot of work with partners that are already engaged in the Indonesia-Australia business ecosystem in order to be able to deliver digital insights on business opportunities. To date, we've worked with partners to produce reports around areas like health, mining, equipment, technology services and education. And we have other insights and information coming around things like packaged food and education and importantly, the halal regulations. As I just mentioned, we are looking at ways to make better use of digital platforms to get content out to our Australian business audiences. I've already mentioned the FTA portal that DFAT has implemented. We also have an FTA seminar series in Australia that's been running for quite some time, and that's pivoted into a digital virtual delivery, and will start to focus very much on IA-CEPA as it comes into force. But importantly, I think we can look at ways of using digital channels to bring our two business communities together, encouraging them to meet digitally, rather if they can't get on a plane, being able to meet digitally and participate in things like virtual business matching or virtual product showcases. So I think we need to be innovative on both sides. Things like webinars like we're doing today are really important to be able to share information and get insights out to our respective communities. So to conclude, IA-CEPA is a terrific outcome, and it will deliver tangible benefits for both Indonesia and Australian businesses. But as I've mentioned, the agreement itself is only but one part of achieving a greater economic integration of our two countries. So the challenge for all of us really is how do we support our businesses and to help them do what they do best, and that's do business together. And how do we encourage them to invest the time and resources to build relationships, particularly now in an environment where it is hard for people to meet face to face? How do we encourage them to make the right connections and make use of the resources that they have at their disposal? So thank you. I'll hand back to you, Philippa, and look forward to the next session.
Great. Thank you so much, Sally, for that wonderful presentation. So let's jump quickly to question and answer. I also want to invite the attendees. If you have question and answer, feel free to drop them in the question and answer box, and hopefully we can get to you. But in the meantime, we already have some questions here. And the first question goes to Valeska, because you talked about the value chain and you gave an example of the value chain. So we have a question from Nisa Usman. The IA-CEPA seems to cover the initial parts of the global value chain, that is the first one-way import-export. Does it also cover the next part of global value chain, or the value-adding production domestically and efforts to the second export?
Thanks, Pipa, and thanks for the question as well. I think the whole notion of being part of that global value chain, it requires the efforts of businesses to work together to achieve that. And what Indonesia businesses have been doing even before the IA-CEPA is to try and explore those avenues. Again, we saw that very much so in the wheat to noodle scenario, for example. But even in the livestock space, we have seen this in the last few years. So there are companies that are looking at how do we turn the raw materials, which is in this case beef or cattle, for example, into a product that can then be exported globally or tap into those third markets. The main constraints at this stage is probably around meeting those international requirements, and that's where the Red Meat and Cattle Partnership is working on to identify some of those barriers and challenges. So, for example, if Indonesia wants to export sausages to Malaysia, for example, what are the health and technical requirements, and what are the systems that's required to meet Malaysia's needs? I think that's something that can be tapped into and explored a bit further, because I think that Indonesia does have a strong value proposition in that space, because Indonesia is probably like the most well known for our beef rendang and beef bakso, for example. I think there is that opportunity to under this agreement, and more broadly, to look into those investments and to tap into the global markets.
Great. Thank you, Valeska. The next question goes to Sally Dean. We have a question from Rafli Ansha from General Ahmad Yani University. And this talks about the trade culture between Australia and Indonesia. So based on Mr. Tanri Abeng's keynote speech at the Business Forum in Perth, there's a sense that the lack of business engagement between Indonesia and Australia is mostly caused by the difference in business culture, where Australian culture is based on formality and legality, while Indonesian culture is less formal and more network-based. So the question from him is that, do you think the statement are relevant about between Australia and Indonesian trade culture? And if it's relevant, then how can we break this barrier to optimize IA-CEPA itself?
Okay, thanks for that question. Yeah, look, I think it is true that there is a difference in business culture between Indonesia and Australia, but that's not uncommon. You know, Australia has a certain business culture, as does any country, and I guess a lot of the work that my team does in Austrade is really, I guess, to try and convey to Australian business that an understanding of what the business culture is in Indonesia is, and how best to engage with Indonesian counterparts. And so we put a lot of emphasis on that, and we also see in IA-CEPA that there is a lot of focus around engaging. So there are some initiatives around there which are really about building people-to-people links. So we see that there is the Working Holiday Maker, an expansion of the Working Holiday Maker. There are some skills pilots, and all of those sorts of initiatives are really about building people-to-people links, deepening the understanding on both sides. So deepening an understanding from the Australian side of Indonesia and your business culture, and likewise for building understanding of Australia and Australian business culture. So those sorts of initiatives I think will really help. And there is a real focus in Australia about the need to help and build business capability and understanding of business culture, not just in Indonesia, but across Asia. So focusing on building Asia business literacy is one of the things that we talk about in Australia. So I think all of those sorts of initiatives can help bridge those sorts of differences. And it's really, as I've said in my presentation, you know, organisations like mine and others that work in this ecosystem, our job is really to encourage business to understand, learn, and engage.
Thank you, Sally. And then the next question goes to Pinkan. In the presentation, you highlighted how investment numbers between Indonesia and Australia are still relatively low given the proximity and the diplomatic relationship that we have. And we have a question here from Greggy Gustavo Tuera about what hinders Australia to invest our country.
Okay, thank you, Pipa, and also Greggy for the question. So we see that based on the quick comparison in the annex sections for the schedules for both countries, it shows that the non-conforming measures in Indonesia is nearly double that of Australia. So in the section specifying limitations to national treatment, Indonesia lists out nearly 150 sectors, which caps Australian ownerships to between 30% and also 67%. And furthermore, the handful of sectors allowing full Australian ownership still have local partner requirements. We see that Australia, on the other hand, didn't have this specific limitations for Indonesia. So it might be a point that focusing on this issue. So it could be easier for Indonesia to invest in Australia compared to the Australia businesses that would like to invest here in Indonesia. So it's more in a technicalities and also related to our existing regulations here in Indonesia. So it could be one of the challenges.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Pinkan. We have a lot of questions, but unfortunately we are running out of time because this is 11:30 already. I'm really sorry to everyone who have submitted questions and we hadn't had a chance to go over it, but hopefully we can follow up and keep in touch to answer some of those questions after this. So last but not least, I want to really thank you, the participants, and also the speakers. Thank you so much, Pinkan. Thank you so much, Valeska, and thank you so much, Sally, for your time and for giving your insights. And thank you as well to our attendees. We have a great number of people show up. We have about 90 people both here from Zoom and also in our YouTube live streaming. And thank you for a very fascinating discussion. We have some final announcements. If we can share the screen in a bit. We have this discussion often, and so this is not our final webinar. We will be having more webinars in the future. And the upcoming webinar, let me share my screen really quickly. Just quickly. Oh, not yet. Sorry, but just some final announcement. Let me... So our next webinar will be about the education sector, and it will be on 25th of June, 2020. This will be on the education sector and the barriers of long distance learning during COVID-19. So that's all of my announcement today. We also, one last announcement, we also publish all of our research, including Pinkan's research on IA-CEPA, which hopefully will be published soon, but you can keep your eyes on that from our website at cips-indonesia.org. So feel free to look at our analysis there. And last but not least, if you enjoy our work and if you would like to support us to continue doing this kinds of webinars and policy analysis, you can consider supporting us through scanning this link right here. That is all for our webinar today. Again, thank you all. Thank you so much, Pinkan, Valeska, and Sally for your time and for your insight. It's such a pleasure to have you and for the discussion. And thank you all the attendees. I hope to see you in another one of these events. Have a great Tuesday, everyone. Thank you so much.